kids with, for like measles. They would give them a pooled injection of immunoglobulins. So we can actively do it. You can get the disease. And if you get the disease, that's very protective. You get the disease, you have lifelong immunity against most things. Now, malaria that we're going to talk about today is an exception, but most infectious diseases you are then immune from. It's why viruses have to constantly mutate, or else we could kill them out in one generation. And then we have artificial, which are vaccines, and we have all kinds of types of vaccines, and they use different approaches to evoke an immune response. So looking at these a little bit more, let's see, I may have covered all of it. So active produced by one's own immunity is very strong. It will last for years, if not a lifetime, especially those from an infection. But some vaccines, especially those that use like a live attenuated, those can evoke a very strong response. The more a vaccine looks like or is the organism, the stronger the immune response. Passive is due to a product, usually. It can be an animal source or another source. And it's a transfer. So it's taking immunity in one outside the body and putting it inside the body. It's pretty effective, but it will decline over time. So we'll see that. So vaccines that require boosters would be in this case. They tend to not evoke as strong of a response. They're usually better tolerated, but you have to continue to re-give them over the lifetime of a person. So antigens. So antigens are non-self, and that's the term we use. They're synonymous. So they can be anything. They can be viruses or live, or they can be inactivated or inanimate objects. Okay, so the immune response. So the immune response, you can think of it in terms of surveillance. So it has, they show these toll-like receptors there on every cell, and they're always watching. T cells that circulate are also surveilling. They can see inside and outside of a cell and tell whether there is foreign or non-self antigens present. You can also think of it as weaponized. So the immune system is weaponized through the B cells that produce antibodies, the weapons that can destroy. And then you have your cleanup group. Your macrophages are like that. Some of your T cells are like that. They clean up dead cells, or they finish them off after they've been so attacked by the rest of the immune system. Then they can finish them off. So we have surveillance, we have weapons, and we have cleanup. Okay, so let's look at the immune response. So when a non-self or a foreign object tries to invade us, you see at the top you've got the innate response up there. So the innate response can be multiple things. So think about things that keep you from getting a virus or a bacteria. What would they be?
Skin.
Skin? What else?
Mucus.
Say it again. Hair, okay. Nasal hair, cilia in the lungs, mucus, okay. Cerumen, okay, waxing your ears, all right. Say it again. Oh, skin oils, okay, yes. Cough, sneeze, okay. So all of those are barriers. The other would be, you see the cytokines, so you got chemical barriers as well. So you got cytokines. So what general type of cytokines would attack a virus or a bacteria?
Bacteria.
Interleukins, interferons, those would be complement. would also be in that group. Okay, so you've got a lot of things that will get to an organism before they ever get very far or traverse the skin. So they're really our first line of defense. And then we come into the more acquired and cellular. We're going to talk about this a little bit more in humoral. So humoral would be your B cells, your antigens. Your cellular response would be your T cells. Remember, we've got a wide variety or subsets of those. And so those are more that we acquire as we come into contact with antigens in the environment. Okay. So let's start, let's look at, the T cells. Where do they come from?
Thymus.
Pardon?
Thymus.
Bone marrow. They migrate to the thymus, and in the thymus they mature, and under hormonal direction they then become different subsets. So what are the subsets of T cells? So you've got killer T cells, helper, memory. You've got suppressor also. Okay, so you got lots of different T cells. They all have their own job. These are what, when they refer to as cell-mediated immunity, that's what they're talking about. Some vaccines can elicit or evoke a T cell response, and some cannot. Those that don't aren't as effective, or we have to give them more often, or they don't keep you from getting the disease as well as others. So you see those memory cells if we go, okay, so we've got a macrophage that has phagocytized, or it has at least intercepted a cell and has then in some way transformed it that then attracts the T cells. So the T cells, then you've got those memory cells, we're going to talk about those. You've got the helper cells, they are the leader of the orchestra. They orchestrate the cell-mediated and humoral immunity. So both of those. They direct the development of antigens, and they direct other T cells to do their job. They communicate a lot through cytokines, so that's how they influence those other T cells to transform or to activate. The killer cells are really the ones at the end that can finish off a cell, and then they show that dead cell. So when we get to HIV, you can see the real problem. When you start killing off killer T cells, you are in big trouble. They're very important to our defense system. So when you look at memory cells, they're amazing, amazing. We are just so amazingly made. So these memory cells, which are part of the immune response. You see all these different types of T cells they're representing through different colors. But those T cells, those memory cells remember how a host or how a organism was defeated in the past, and they can bring that same success to another invasion. So they remember strategy. So and this gives you and they're long-lived. 20 years, that's a long time. So then you can see the speed of the response and the magnitude of the response is so much greater than it was the first time with the help of those memory cells. So that's what they're talking about when they're talking about immune memory. The others that play a role are the B cells. So these are the ones that secrete antibodies, and that they make antibodies that are very specific to an antigen. And they're antibody production factories, and they pour a lot of them out that circulate and are always available for other cells to use in order to combat an invading organism usually. Let's look at antibodies. We've talked about these before. So they have a specific structure. You see the one under the electron microscope, and then our cartoon production of that. So they're kind of a wet Y shape. That base is always the same. It's fairly similar throughout antibodies. But it's those sections at the top, the little prongs, that are then specific in specific regions for different antigens. And antibodies take the form of the different immunoglobulins. So the IgGs, the IgM, E's, D's, and A. We have talked about before, whoops, oh, I moved it to a different section. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the killer cells. So I'm going to remedy this next year. I'm too short to keep doing this. So here is, this shows you the T's. This is kind of a repeat of what we did before, but I found another thing I really like. So this is looking at a T lymphocyte, T killer cell, and that shows little clips at the top of it coming across a cancer cell, and how quickly, within 30 minutes, it has phagocytized and destroyed it. Very powerful. So these cells constantly patrol. They're always about, but they are really directed and influenced by those T helper cells. This is kind of a summary slide. It's really good. It starts with the invading organism and the macrophages being the first cell there that starts the process, antigen processing cell. And you see there that the first is those helper T cells. And several things that they do. One is that they increase their own production. They influence the B cells, which produce the antibodies, and then they also influence those T killer cells. All right, so our vaccines are going to help or take advantage of, or they're going to evoke different responses. Almost all of them will evoke a humoral response. So humoral is which one? Or the B cells. So B cells, when they mature, they move through the body through the different body fluids. And because in Latin that is referred to humor, then that's where humoral response. To me, it's like we should have lost it a long time ago. It's just so confusing and antiquated. But that's why we call it humoral immunity. Okay. All right, everybody up to speed on that? Pretty much repeat. You've heard these things all before and you know them. Okay. All right. Did you all talk about this with pediatric immunizations? Okay. So passive immunity, transfer of antibodies, some protection always is going to be temporary. It'll be a short period of time that a person would be protected. So these are used more in different diseases. Sometimes if you want to improve their immunity for short periods of time. We talked about maternal antibodies and those crossing the placenta. Also, we talked about, when we did lactation, about the passive movement of some of those immunoglobulins through breast milk for at least the first 6 months. Another way we have taken advantage of that is through monoclonal antibodies. So if we give somebody an infusion of immunoglobulins, they're polyclonal, so they're multiple sources, multiple books. So the monoclonal antibodies came along around 1980s. And it started with the ability to clone a perpetual cell, a cell that could live forever. And we could put it into a host and make that host produce the antibody that we wanted to a specific antigen. Remember we talked when we did RSV about Synagis? RSV therapy? It's a monoclonal antibody. We did it in several different diseases. So for the mouse was the first organism that was used. I've showed you this one several times because whatever host you use will determine how much it looks like human antibody. And the more it looks like a human antibody, the less likely your immune system is to produce an antibody against it. So we talked about like ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease. We talked a lot about different antibody sort types and the fact that like Remicade has a lot of neutralizing antibodies. So it renders it less effective over time. So it shows you the little cartoon at the bottom. So the murine. And then chimeric are ones that are part human, part mouse. And then you've got humanized, almost looks exactly like the human, and then you've got fully humanized, and it's 100%. So this one shows you at the top, as you're approaching more humanized, and that the names tell you what they are. So UMAB is human, MOMAB is mouse, chimeric is ZUMAB, and humanized is, I've forgotten the difference between those pronunciations, sorry. This one shows you the difference in immunogenicity, so from mouse to human. Okay, let's talk about active immunity then. So active immunity gives you more lifelong, so stronger immunity. So a lot of our vaccines take advantage of this, and getting the disease also helps, and you get good immunologic memory. Now, I don't know where you stand on vaccinations, but before we had vaccines, parents would, if some kid in the neighborhood got an illness, say they got chicken pox, and everybody took their family over there and exposed them, and then you got it over with. So this is a post from a pediatrician, I think in Seattle. She had 2 kids, so she must be an anti-vaccination pediatrician. She no longer immunizes kids against chicken pox, so she had a chicken pox party, invited the kids over to get exposed. So you'll see these types of arguments that if the child gets the disease, then their immunity is better than if they're vaccinated. So let me show you. So chicken pox is deadly. It can kill kids. And here this is the Varicella Deaths prior to the vaccine that was introduced in 1995. So you see quite a drop-off once we started vaccinating kids because they no longer get the disease. So that's the big advantage of vaccines over getting the illness, is that you get the protection, but you don't have the risk of the disease. Comments or questions about that? Anybody anti-vaccine in here would like to give their opinion? I see smiles, but no. Okay, well. All right. So vaccination produces an active immunity, produces antibodies, develops immunologic memory, no risk of disease. So let's look at the types of vaccines we have. So there's live attenuated. So live attenuated are vaccines that are usually a bred down version of the wild vaccine. So the wild vaccine is what is out there in nature. Okay. To produce the measles vaccine, they took blood from a child who had the measles in 1954, and through 10 years, they eventually got an attenuated version that's now used as the basis of the measles vaccine and the MMRs. So they can still evoke a very strong response. Then there's inactivated. Most of our vaccines are going to be inactivated. So there's whole cell vaccines. There's fractional vaccines, they just take a part of it. There's subunit vaccines, there's saccharide, there's conjugated polysaccharide, there's recombinant vaccines, and there's toxoids. So there's lots of different types. We're going to walk through each of those, what they are today. So the alive, attenuated, weakened form of the virus. These are ones you cannot give to immunocompromised folks, and we don't give them to pregnant women. They have to replicate to produce an immune response. They usually don't produce the disease. There's one exception, and that was the polio vaccine, which did revert back to wild type when it was used. But that's the only one I know of. Usually these are one-time doses. So these rarely require a booster dose. So that's nice. You get longevity with these vaccines. Second dose is sometimes given just to get a higher response. Severe reactions are possible if they've got, let's say they've been exposed before and it was a subclinical infection, they can render or have enough antibodies to render the vaccine not as good or not to get as big a response. They are fragile, so when it talks about fragility, usually the storage requirements on these are much higher. And that becomes a real problem in a clinic because of people moving it in and out of the refrigerator, it not being received or properly stored when it is received, so these tend to degrade much faster. The current ones are those listed, so measles, mumps, rubella, varicella, yellow fever, the rotavirus, and the intranasal influenza, which hasn't been recommended every year, but this year they are recommending or saying that it can be effective and used. The inactivated, so heat, chemicals, something that renders it no longer live. Can't replicate, can't cause disease even in an immunocompromised person. Always requires multiple doses, so we'll see this, like with hepatitis B, you have to give 3 courses of it. The immune response is humoral only, so it does not usually evoke a T cell response. And it may require a booster because it will go down over time or wane over time. Here are the inactivated whole viral vaccines. There's not that many of them. Hep A, rabies, polio. The Hep A would probably be the more common. The fractional vaccines, so these are subunits. Hepatitis B, one of the influenzas is. The acellular pertussis, which is in the tetanus pertussis and diphtheria. The HPV virus, the HPV vaccine, and anthrax. And then we have 2 toxoids, which are diphtheria and tetanus. The polysaccharide vaccines, these are inactivated subunits. These came about probably 20 or 30 years ago. They actually take part of the cell membrane of the bacterium and they have created antibodies against them. The problem is that these don't tend to be very effective over time, that you can't give them to children under 2 because their immune systems are so immature that they won't respond. So what they did how they have changed those, if they have found if they conjugate them, they are more effective. And they can be given to kids under 2. They do need booster vaccines. So the boosters. So HIB, which was the first one that came out, first conjugated, the pneumococcal and the meningococcal. Recombinant vaccines. So these are the ones where we genetically engineer them. And more of the vaccines are producing them. Usually, like with influenza, you can get a recombinant vaccine, as well as an inactivated or a live attenuated. So we've talked about this before, of taking the genetic engineering and putting it in a host cell like a yeast and getting the host cell to produce it. So vaccines that we use now are hepatitis B, the HPV, and the influenza. So all of them are similar. These will actually evoke more of a T cell response. So some of these are better than what you'll find with just like the polysaccharide. So those are the different type. And I'll point those out as we go through them today. Have they showed you this before, herd effect? We've talked about herd effect. Very important concept. And that's why we try to get so many people to do flu vaccine every year, is to get that herd effect. So the top one shows you that if in a population and your people, the blue people are you're healthy but not immunized, and you introduce a couple of people with disease, what happens to your population? They all get sick, most of them. So you have a few blue ones who are not immunized, but they don't get it. So centuries ago, that's who survived, right? In the second scenario, you have people who are immunized, you have people who are not immunized but healthy, and then you introduce sick people. What happens to your population? They still get sick. And then in your bottom ones, if you have most of the population that gets immunized, what happens to your population? They stay healthy, and guess what happens with the blue people? Fewer of them get the disease, right? Okay, this is the scenario. If we stay on this trajectory of people not immunizing our kids, here's where we go, back here. So, something to consider. Well, because I think people forget. They didn't live in the time when there wasn't. So my mom lived before the polio vaccine. So she told me about her friends who died. She said in grade school, you just have friends who died. Or they went to the hospital and they went those iron lungs until they died. She got a low variant. So she had one leg that was always smaller and shorter than the other. So she had one built up, and it caused her lots of back problems. So I just don't think people remember. So I remember everybody got. In my family, chicken pox went through. One kid got it, then the next kid got it, then I was the last one. So I had the worst. My sister had very mild. It just got progressively worse as it went through. The other thing is that when my son, he was born in '93, so he was eligible for about the first round of chickenpox vaccination. And one of my thinking is that when you have the chickenpox, your kid is out of daycare for about 7 to 10 days. That is a huge impact on work. It's like, I can't sit home 10 days. Plus, it's a miserable disease if you've not ever had it. So, anyway. I am a proponent of vaccination. It comes down to risk and benefit. Everybody wants all benefit, no risk. It just doesn't happen. There is not one drug that exists that way. And there are people who make their living off of that reason. Okay? So when you take a vaccine, you are taking on a risk, but the benefit is huge. So here's that herd effect again. So if a lot of people are vaccinated, those that can't be vaccinated are protected from the person who, or they have some degree of protection from the person who is not vaccinated. Because you have all these people who could come in contact with this person and not get the disease. And so they can't spread it to the rest of the population. So that's what we do every year with influenza. We try to get enough people vaccinated so that we don't then give it to somebody else. Okay? So you as healthcare providers most likely will be required to be vaccinated against certain things, or they won't let you practice. Because you come in contact with people all the time that will have disease, and you don't want to give it to other people in the practice that also have it. Okay. Questions about these? Any thoughts differently?
I have a question.
Yes.
How do you approach people who are
It's hard. I'll tell you where I found it the most was with African Americans and the flu shot. So they remember in their culture the Tuskegee and what was done to people with investigational drugs, and I get it. I get it. So I would just tell them, I would give them the same kind of thing. I would say those that already believed it was true would go ahead and get it. Those who didn't want to get it or had a reason to be suspicious didn't get it. I don't think I changed a whole lot of people, but I mostly dealt with older adults. I didn't deal with peds as much. Anybody here practice in a peds group?
I didn't, but I know one thing that they'll do is a lot of people, they're afraid of the autism and all that kind of stuff, is they'll spread out their vaccines. So instead of doing 4 months and they do, 5 vaccines at one time, they'll have them come back in 2 weeks or have them come back in a month. And so some of those parents that have that fear, that kind of calms it a little bit so they're not overloading their kid with vaccines.
You all just live in a time where very few people have infectious disease. I'm telling you, it's different. It's different. I think people get fairly used to not seeing a lot of sick kids or having a lot of sick kids, not seeing kids with the measles, not seeing kids with the mumps.
I heard an argument for the spreading out schedule is to not overwhelm the immune system with multiples at a time. Does that make any sense?
I don't know if there's any data that says one way or the other. There is data that says that if you even spread out the length of time between, like you'll see with Hep B, you need first dose 1 month, 6 months. And so they're finding now that even if you go longer than that, maybe that 1 month or past 6 months, you don't have to start all over again, which we used to do. We start all over again. So that's the only data I've seen. I haven't seen anything that says fewer injections. And what is overwhelming you're not usually giving a lot, except with MMR, you're giving 3 live attenuated. We get bombarded every day with pathogens, and we tend to do okay. Yeah.
But some of the infectious disease doctors I worked with, they said the vaccines, most of them work better together, so that spreading them out into the single doses isn't always as good.
You might get a stronger immune response.
When they're given together in a combination, that's why they were scheduled that way.
Yeah, could be. Makes sense.
But yeah, they had the same thoughts about the immune system, like how can you say it's bombarded when the baby's already out in the world with everything else. But.
Anything else? Other comments? Okay, so immunizing adults. I remember when I got to be about 6, I asked my mother, is that it? Is that it? Is that all the shots I have to have? And when I got to be about 6 years old, there really weren't that many more shots until you got to college. And then in college, at that point, they required you to have tetanus, diphtheria, pertussis again, a booster. And that was about it. So now there's lots of them. So adults may get to the point where they go, I don't have to have any more injections. But now we've got a whole host of things that we can immunize adults against. So one of if you read on the CDC or the Committee on Immunizations, one of their approaches is that make it a part of all of your visits with an adult. And they recommend like an opt-out. Like, this is what we do. Not that, we have this injection. If you'd like to have it, we'll give it to you today. Instead of, you're due for this today, and then have them refuse. See, it's easier for people to it's easier to opt in than it is to opt out. It's hard to opt out. So make it part of your practice if you're dealing in a more prevention mode, internal medicine or primary care mode with your patients. A lot of EMRs will have this as standards built into their system, which will prompt you often. So remembering flus are easy to remember. Tetanus, diphtheria, it's hard to remember. It's 10 years in between. So what do you do? For varicella, and a lot of these are coming now with 50 and 60-year-olds. They are usually more educated, and sometimes they will prompt you more than you having to go after them. So you're familiar with this little graph. Okay. So let's look at the influenza virus. How many of you had your flu shots? Okay, good. The recommendation is get them by the end of October. Okay, so I know the rest of you have plans to do that, right? You only have about a week. Okay. So the influenza virus, I showed you this one back when we did pneumonia. They look alien-like, don't they? So if you look at the top, that blue are the hemagglutinin surface proteins, and then the pink are those neuraminidase. So you'll see that at least the viral A's are named after those, H1N1, a very viral, very virulent virus, and we still, in our vaccines today, vaccinate people against that H1N1. It was a very bad flu that came through in 2009. You may not remember that, but it was, it's still part of our vaccines today. This is the 100th year of the 1918 pandemic. So, look at how many people, 500 million people infected worldwide. And it wasn't just 1 year, it spread over like 1918 to 1920. 50 to 100 million people died. 5% of the world population died. 1 in 20 people died. That's why people get so excited at the CDC about getting your flu vaccine every year. The deaths, here's the problem. Most of the time we think of flu deaths in the weakened, the old, the vulnerable. In this pandemic, it was the young, healthy, it's all of you that would have died. Okay? And they think it was because that there was an overreaction of the immune system. That they actually were healthy people, that when that virus presented itself, they overreacted immune-wise, because it was the healthy that died and not the sick. The sick didn't get it, they didn't get sick or they didn't contract it because they couldn't mount an immune response. So you see all the things that happened. Churches didn't hold services, funerals weren't done, the libraries were closed because that used to be where you went and hung out. Even growing up, that's what we would do. We'd go hang out in the library. You could get back in those little stacks. Nobody could see you. Yep. So dances were banned. So anything where you brought a lot of people together. So that's the headlines from 1918. So remember, flu is mostly in the spring, is when it hits its peak. Starts in October, that's why we will start to vaccinate about September. And remember, it takes several weeks for that immune response to maximize. And so this is the most vulnerable time of the year. But any time after that, it's always better to have it than not have it. Okay. So still most people don't get it. Even the majority of adults still don't get vaccinated. So this is a little bit old data, but probably pretty consistent. What I fear this year is because last year's was so ineffective, people this year won't get it.
Is that why they're recommending the intranasal form this year?
No, it's just more effective this year.
Oh, okay.
It hadn't been effective the last 2 years, so that's why they discouraged it. I'll come back to page 2. I skipped it, but I'll come back after we finish 4. So I am back to your handout on page 3. If you look at the top, you'll see following in influenza vaccination, you have several designations. So that IIV is inactivated fractional vaccine. So it's one of the common ones. The next one is the live attenuated influenza vaccine. That's the nasal, intranasal. And then there is a recombinant form as well. So there's all different types. The CDC has deemed that they are all effective, as long as you're using it for age appropriate, and different ones of these will be recommended in different age groups. So it's recommended for everybody 6 months and up. What's different about the first time you get it? You must talk that in peds.
The 2 doses.
You give 2 doses to kids, first time they've had it. After that, it's one injection for adults, kids and adults. So one of the problems with vaccines in the past has been is that we grow them in eggs. It's easy, got lots of them. And that caused a lot of problems because people who had severe reactions to egg proteins could have anaphylactic reactions to the vaccines. So they have taken a lot of different tacks now. And so this is one of the first years where they recommend that even people who have egg allergies can receive the flu vaccine. When you look at, you may never have paid attention, but you always sign two pieces of paper when you get a flu vaccine. And one of them it will ask you is, are you allergic to eggs? It'll ask you, do you have a fever? Have you been sick in the last few days? So that will come off of that form this year. We talked about when flu season starts. Okay, so flu vaccines, they are somewhat confusing, I think, because there's so many different forms. So there's 5 different types. So there's a 3-strain, there's a 4-strain. There's a nasal, intranasal, there's a high dose, and there's a preservative-free. So the 3-strain is called the trivalent, the 4-strain is called the quadrivalent, and then the intranasal and the high dose. I'll go through those. So then you have standard dose. Most of what you have probably gotten in the past are standard dose. The high dose usually is for adults over 65. And it is used to evoke a stronger response out of older people. And they make limited amounts. So most clinics are pretty restrictive in who they'll give them to. And they run out quickly. So 65 and above is who is indicated for those high dose flu vaccines. So the trivalent protects against 3 different strains, 2 A strains, 1 B strain. So if you see down there the H1N1, that's the one that people are most worried about. And the other is the H2N3, H3N2. So that's one that will affect birds, swine, people. So when we had an avian flu scare, that was one of the ones we even gave separate injections for that. So that's what the 2 A's. The B's are variable, and the B's will vary based on what they think is going to be the predominant strain. That's where they missed the mark last year. They don't miss very often, but so the 1B strain in the trivalent, 2B strains in the quadrivalent. Does not matter which one you get. Most clinics I've been associated with carry the quadrivalent once it became available. 80% of the ones this year that are produced, manufactured, are quadrivalent. So I think that's what most people will end up getting. There's very few manufacturers of these. So sometimes the projection of amounts is limited. So there's always a prioritization of who should get it. There have been years where we have run out of flu vaccine, and not everybody could get it. The last few years, that hasn't been the case. The live attenuated, again, for the last 2 years, they have not recommended they be used because they were not effective. But this year, they can be used. So they're mostly kids and up to 49 years old with adults. So over 50 and over, we don't use the intranasal spray. It is live attenuated, so not for pregnant, not for immunocompromised. It is meant to have the influenza virus replicate in the nose, but it won't do it in the lungs. I don't know how they do that, but that's the magic. And so and it's also meant to improve the injection for children, or vaccine for children. Products this year at the bottom, 80% are quadrivalent. You'll see you can get a quadrivalent inactivated, quadrivalent recombinant, live attenuated, that's the flu mist, and trivalent. The Fluzone high dose is a trivalent for the adults. You'll see at Fluad there's an adjuvant. So sometimes you'll see vaccines that have adjuvants added. Those are always added in order to boost the immune response. So if you see that term in the vaccine's name, that's what that means. On the next page, there are cell-based vaccines. So people who have very high likelihood of having anaphylactic reaction can do cell-based. Any questions about the flu vaccine? It can be given with most other vaccines. So a good time to look when you give the influenza in the fall is couple it with a Pneumovax or the Prevnar 13. They can be given together. It's a really good time to remember for your people who are at high risk or your 65 and older. Okay, if you'll go back to page 2, let me pick up that page. Most adults have not gotten all the vaccines they should. Just assume that. A lot of young people will not know what they need. Do you all know all the vaccines you should be getting? No. So most adults don't either. So immunization status. This is an easy one to set up for your MAs or your nurses to go through and look at, or to have an EMR pop up that comes up and says you're due for this today. Documentation is really important. It's terrible to have somebody get a vaccine they don't need because it probably doesn't do them any good and it's just costly. And some of them cost a lot of money. Flu vaccine doesn't, but like Pneumovax cost about $250. I mean, they're ridiculous. So it's important to be good stewards of that as well. So did you all talk about the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices when you did the PEDS? Okay. So this is a group, and I've given you the people who are, that make this up. So this is an advisory group. They meet throughout the year. And you'll see under that third, they have 15 voting members. So they have 14 that are pretty much health professionals, and then they have 1 member at large from the community. And then they have ex officios and non-voting representatives, so there's lots of people with immunization expertise that sit on this. This is probably the most important committee in terms of vaccination schedules for the United States, because they write everything I've given you, that it's their recommendations. Their recommendations are made to the CDC. The CDC either adopts them all or most of them, and then they publish them. And they're published every year in usually Morbidity and Mortality Weekly, and they usually will publish them in one of the other major medical journals. So I've got a little ticker set to watch for them every year. Usually by the fall they've got them out. This year they were a little bit delayed on the adults, but for the most part they're going to come out about the same time every year. And then you'll update. Peds and adults come out separately. And I gave you the link for them. All right. So if somebody quotes to you, you'll know who they are. Important group. If you really like immunizations, their meetings are open as well. You can attend them online or in person. Okay, let's take a break and we'll come back at 5 till and we'll pick